Greetings and welcome back, everybody. This is the CYSA Plus class. My name is Dr. Brandon Brown, and we're going to get into domain 9 now. We're going to start talking about how we build an incident response program. So let me share my screen. All right. So this lecture is going to cover, again, getting into domain 3. We're going to look at the concepts related to an attack methodology and their frameworks. Look at ways that we can perform incident response activities, and explain the preparation for post-incident recovery phases. And this is probably one of the most important phases to recover from an incident. And again, remember that an incident is not necessarily a hacker attack or a breach. It could be a power failure. It could be a failure of a system or a component of a system. So let's look at security incidents and their terms. So we have events, we have adverse events, we have security incidents, and computer security incident response teams. So each of these definitions is very critical for you to understand. An event is pretty much anything that happens, good, bad, or otherwise. An adverse event is bad. A security incident is something that happens that is going to be relegated to some sort of breach or a breach of security protocol. And a computer security incident response team are those incident responders who are formed into teams that respond to these security incidents, and they're responsible for figuring out what happened, when it happened, how it happened, and how to make it never happen again, and also to fix the problems with that incident to get back to status quo. So let's look at the phases of an incident. So your incident response phase is cyclical, similar to software development lifecycle. You can put it into those terms. We have preparation, detection, right, where we detect the breach or we detect the event. The preparation, everything that goes into that works up to being able to detect the event. Containment, eradication, and recovery. So this is the key component of the incident response team. Post-incident activity, and then this is where we'll do lessons learned and postmortems and figure out what we did right, what we did wrong, what we could, do better, and then we go back into the preparation phase. So let's talk about that preparation phase. We're going to create the computer security incident response team. We're going to form it. Who needs to be on the team? What expertise do we need? We'll build the defenses around technical controls, risk controls, etc. And we'll assemble the incident investigation, hardware, software, and information. So where are we going to look to figure out what happens if an incident occurs? Most times, for example, we may have logs on systems, but hackers, if they breach the system, one of the first things they do is they delete those logs. So how do we get around that? Well, we have to aggregate those logs off onto a separate platform. We have to make sure that that platform is secure. We have to make sure that we monitor that platform, etc. And we make backups of everything. In the detection and analysis phase, this is where we're going to look at alerts and logs, any publicly available information. So if a hacker breaks in and they say request a ransom, have they leaked any of that out into the public domain? And what people are responsible for this activity? Who are the folks in the SOC, for example? Who are the folks who are doing the analysis of the logs? So some of the actions to improve the effectiveness of incident analysis are here. So a couple to kind of really hone down on. Filtering information is one of the most important pieces of this. So you want to make sure that you don't overlook anything, but you also want to kind of weed through all the noise. This is really important in log aggregation. And there are many tools out there that are built for incident responders to help you do that. They can be expensive, they can be quite hard to implement, and they can also cause a strain on your network and systems if you don't have them scoped out correctly. So synchronization of clocks, so using NTP, for example, is a very, very, very important, especially if you ever want to go into litigation. Perform event correlation so that you look at events that correspond to one another across multiple systems. Your logging policy. How are you logging your systems? Where are you keeping those logs? How are you safeguarding those logs? And the last point there, seek assistance. This is a lot of times well over the head of most folks who are running small to mid-sized businesses. They don't have a dedicated incident response team. So there are third parties out there, your Rapid7s, your CrowdStrikes, your Cylances, your Mandiants, etc., that you can hire to do this type of activity because it's not necessarily, and hopefully not necessary all the time. So you can contain, eradicate, and recover. This is the next step in the process. So selecting a containment strategy, a lot of times this is going to be prevalent on what platform or what tools you've chosen. Implement that strategy, gather additional evidence or artifacts, help identify the attacker. Is the attacker a hacking group? Is it a syndicate? And you might take that information and pass it off to law enforcement and then eradicate the effects. So get back to status quo. Take out the nasties, take out the viruses, take out the malware, and get the system back to a state of operational effectiveness. Your post activity, this is where you're going to catalog all of your evidence. You're going to run a lessons learned review, and this might be a small mini project inside of the incident. And you're going to figure out, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? What can we do better? What tools worked? What tools didn't work? And you're going to do a what we sometimes refer to as a post-mortem. And it's very important that that gets communicated back up through management so that additional resources may be requested. So let's talk about how we build the foundation for an incident response program. It starts with policies. This is a statement of management's commitment to the IR program. Without this, you're basically just kind of stumbling around in the dark. If you don't have management's buy-in for an incident response program, get it. It's about the best thing I can say. Scope that policy. To whom does it apply, and under what types of circumstances? Who gets to call when an incident actually happens? Who is the management person that defines the incident? Organizational structure. So what are the roles and responsibilities of the IR team? What level of authority do they have to take action? Who prioritizes or categorizes severity ratings for incidents? How do you measure the effectiveness of your incident response team? And do you have standardized reporting and contact forms for any stakeholders, vendors, etc., who you need to keep up to date or reach out to have help from? So procedures and playbooks. So this is very important, and a lot of IR teams, when they're not actively working an incident, this is where they play. Writing the procedures and the playbooks, what are the step-by-steps if something happens, and they go through all different types of scenarios. So they just have a few listed here, but there are many, many, many more. So they give some examples such as, a web page defacement, loss of a laptop, a phishing attack, spear phishing attack for that matter, general security incident not covered by another playbook, breach of a personal financial information. Is that one person? Is it 100,000 people or more? And that last bullet point there, basically, if you come across an incident that is not covered by a different playbook, you build another playbook. You start a new one. So in the incident response checklist, you'll have, it's kind of like a waterfall project management plan. You'll have different things that you will go through and ensure that you're not missing something when you start an incident. Now, things may crop up, and new tools or techniques or additional steps may come about as you are going through the process of incident response. That's okay. Make a note on these checklists so that when you get to that lessons learned portion of the meeting, you can add it back into the checklist. Okay. These checklists get rather lengthy, or can get rather lengthy, depending on the type of incident. So, how do we form an incident response team? So, there are a lot of different types of members from staff that can join the IR team. So, it's regardless to say, we're going to need technical people, right? We're going to need the subject matter experts. These are the folks who are going to run the tools and techniques. These are the people who are going to have system administration access to the servers and PCs and routers and switches and firewalls and security appliances, the SIM, etc. All right. The IT support staff and the security folks are going to coordinate very closely, and they're the ones who are going to find out how the breach happened and formulate a plan on how to recover from it. Now, the next three areas here are a little bit more ancillary. They're around the edges of this core technical team. Legal counsel, so they would need to be informed so that they can understand what the legality risk, litigation risk might be. What's the possibility of the company getting sued? Was there somebody that could be at fault that the company can seek retribution from? HR staff, this is typically if you have an insider incident, somebody from the inside of the company did something wrong. Did they breach company policy? Did they break a uh, s- uh, civil act to where they could be sued? Did they breach a criminal act to where they could be prosecuted? Public relations and marketing staff basically handle a lot of the the fallout, if you will, from a breach. So they're the ones who would be reaching out to customers, to outside stakeholders, to keep them up to date, the public at large, depending on the nature of the organization. So let's talk about the IR team's scope of control. These are triggers that activate the IR team. Who's authorized to activate the IR team? We talked about that a little bit previously. Does the IR team cover the entire organization, or is it solely responsible for certain business units? Is it centralized or decentralized, basically? Is the IR team authorized to communicate with law enforcement? If not, who is? Is that go to legal counsel? Is that management? Who are the regulatory bodies or other external parties? All right. So who communicates to these folks? Does the who on the team communicates? Who from marketing or PR is going to be there? And does the IR team have internal communication or escalation responsibilities? If so, how does that pan out? What are the triggers for escalating? Who calls law enforcement? Who contacts the FBI? I mean, there's all types of questions that have to be put into this policy document, or this procedural document, I should say, as to what happens and then what happens next. So let's talk a little bit about coordination and information sharing. So here, the communication is probably one of the most important pieces of an IR team. There's internal and external communication. From a technical standpoint, you're going to be primarily concerned with internal communication. So, and that's going to be finding out what happened, how to fix it, to make sure it never happens again, saving evidence so that the external folks can communicate with um, law enforcement, information sharing partners, i.e., the press, other organizations, media, and general public. I should say that the press is information sharing partners might be folks within your own internal organization, like your intranet. Um, They do get one thing wrong here, in my opinion. Vendors, these could be people who work with third parties who are subject matter experts on your platform, say your SIM or your security appliance. They need to have at least a dotted line to the internal communication so that they can talk to um, the technical folks. So this is kind of a little a blurred line, but you need to make sure that you have that support structure. So let's talk a little bit about how we classify an incident. There are all types of threat classifications. Um, and we could break this down 20 ways to Sunday. But these are probably the top 8 or 10, or 9 or 10, and about top 9 or 8. And you have unknown and other down there. Why you have unknown and other, I don't know, but I guess if something doesn't fall in those top 7, uh, it would happen. So threat classification is also sometimes referred to as an attack vector, or you could relate it to an attack vector. Um, and this is the means of the threat actor getting into the system. Then there's severity. So if we lost a laptop or if we had a breach, what did they have or potentially have access to? So we have to classify that severity of the potential loss of asset. What is the scope of impact? What are the data types? How impactful the threat was it? Did we lose PII, for example, of customers, of employees, of third parties? Um, and what actions do we need to look at taking because of that loss? So here's just a good overall generalization of impact categories by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, their 800-61 publication. They have none, low, medium, and high. So this is a good catch-all general functional impact. Then we have economic impact, again, similar, where we have, and you classify this based on financial loss or potential financial loss. And this could change from company to company. So this could be for, say, a small to mid-sized business, whereas if you had a Fortune 100 company, they might not even get low financial loss until it hits, say, $500,000 or $100,000, right? So each organization is going to have a different tolerance to the economic impact. The recoverability effort. So how hard is it going to be to recover from this incident? Is it regular? Is it supplemented, extended? Is it not recoverable? And hopefully we never get to that one. But this is basically based on time. So is it predictable with existing? Is it predictable with additional resources? Do we have to go out and get a SME or a vendor? Is it extended? The time to recover is unpredictable. We don't really know, but we know we can. It is possible. Maybe we have to replace equipment or something of that nature. And then not recoverable. It's gone. Sensitive data was exfilled and then it was posted publicly. In addition to that, it was wiped from our systems and wiped from our backups. That is the worst case scenario from a recoverability standpoint. Information impact categories. This is where we're going to look at the breach itself. So if there's no impact, no information was exfilled. If it's a privacy breach, sensitive, PII was exfilled, could be information on with like social security numbers, account numbers, etc. Proprietary breach, unclassified proprietary information such as protected critical infrastructure information was exfilled or exfiltrated. And then an integrity loss. This is the worst. Sensitive or proprietary information was changed or deleted. Say you had engineering designs of your next widget that you were getting ready to put through production and sell, and it's all of a sudden it's gone. That would be an integrity loss. Private organization information impact categories. This is where we look at from a private institute standpoint, information that was at the informational level that was lost. We look at regulatory information, intellectual property, confidential information, or all the above. It was changed or deleted in the latter case. But the two here to really kind of look at is the confidential information and the regulated information breaches. So in a regulated information, information regulated by an external compliance obligation, let's say PCI DSS, which they give in this example. So if you lost, or even better, HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability Act. If you lost patient records, that would be not just a huge problem for the organization, it could result in fines and penalties. So it's good to know who regulates you and what are the consequences if you have a breach and loss of information. So let's talk a little bit about frameworks. So we have Meter's attack framework. And this is broken up to on-prem and in the cloud. This is one of the good overall frameworks for looking at incident response. And it includes sections for cloud-based assets and platforms. So the diamond model of intrusion analysis, this model is intended to help analysts discover more information by highlighting the relationship between different elements of features. So this is kind of a higher end analysis of the organization as a whole and how platforms fit in with data, how data moves across the proverbial business plane. And then you have the diamond model intrusion analysis that we look at from a structural point of view, from infrastructure, capability, the adversary, and the victim in a step-by-step cyclical process. Then we have, last but not least, Lockheed Martin's cyber kill chain. This is something you may have heard about, but this is developed by Lockheed Martin. And this is a good representation of the offensive security practice. So here we have the reconnaissance of an asset, the weaponization of a tool to exploit a vulnerability that was found, the delivery of that weapon, the exploitation of the target, installation of tools for persistence, such as backdoors, implementation of C2, command and control, so that we can maintain said persistence, even if an incident response team tries to take it away from us. And then actions on the objective. So what are we looking for? What is the goal as the offensive actor, the bad actor that we're trying to do? So that wraps it up here for Chapter 9 in building an incident response program. Hope you enjoyed it. And I will see you in Chapter 10. Have a great day.